are calling it iPhone.
12 years ago this month, Steve Jobs announced
A widescreen iPod with touch controls. Revolutionary mobile phone. Breakthrough internet communications device.
but it wasn't 3 products. It was 1 product.
Are you getting it?
Yeah, we got it, Steve. It was the iPhone. Welcome back. So great you could be here. I'm Rene Ritchie, and this is Vector. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs put Sneaker to stage for what was the most incredible keynote presentation of his life, of a life filled with incredible keynote presentations.
Actually, it was really just that moment where even before he announced it, there was that like horizon picture of the Apple logo, just with sort of like, I don't know if it's the sun or the moon coming up or whatever. There's some light coming up behind the Apple logo. And he had a very long pause there, and he said, this is a day that I've been, waiting 3.5 years for. And I remember saying, the way he just did that, the way he paused, the way he delivered it, the poise and the calm in his voice, he just felt very genuine. You felt like he really meant it. And Steve was always a showman and a salesman, but that felt like a really genuine moment.
Just before he stepped out in front of the crowd, Jobs assembled his team and told them to remember the moment before iPhone, because in the very next moment, everything would change.
Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything.
With the iPhone, they'd be going for 3. Jobs carefully set up and then absolutely knocked down the physical keyboards and the stylus, features that dominated the BlackBerry, Nokia, Motorola, and Palm smartphones of the day.
Yuck.
Then Jobs introduced the multi-touch interface that let iPhone smoothly pinch to zoom, the physics-based interactivity that included that inertial scrolling and rubber banding, and the multitasking that let him move seamlessly from music to call to web to email and back again.
Yes, I'd like to order 4,000 lattes to go, please. No, just kidding. Wrong number, thank you.
They're technologies that have now become commonplace across the industry, but back then they looked like something out of the movies, out of science fiction. Then there was the price.
Now, these phones sort of do music, but nobody uses them for music because they're not very good, and so they end up buying an iPod to go with the phone. We know we sell the iPod. So how much more than $499 should we price iPhone? For 4-gigabyte model, we're going to price it at that same $499. No premium whatsoever. $499. And we're going to have an 8-gigabyte model for just $599.
The entrenched incumbents in the smartphone space were some of its harshest critics. That was, after all, their jobs. Ed Colligan, former CEO of Palm. We've learned and struggled for a few years here figuring out how to make a decent phone. PC guys are not going to just figure this out. They're not going to just walk in. Mike Lazaridis, former CEO of RIM, now BlackBerry. Talk. All I'm hearing is talk about the iPhone's chances in enterprise. Apple's approach produced devices that inevitably sacrificed advanced features for aesthetics. Steve Ballmer, former CEO of Microsoft.
Right now, we're selling millions and millions and millions of phones a year. Apple is selling 0 phones a year. In 6 months, they'll have the most expensive phone by far ever in the marketplace. And let's see, what's the expression? Let's see how the competition goes.
Google, an original iPhone launch partner, was both more perceptive and more agile. They'd already bought Danger, the next-generation phone platform created by Sidekick mastermind and former Apple employee Andy Rubin. They'd originally focused on making a Windows Mobile, BlackBerry, Nokia-style keyboard phone competitor, determined to make sure Microsoft would never dominate the market and cut Google out of search in the mobile future they so clearly recognized would be the next big thing. Google's then CEO, Eric Schmidt, was on Apple's board of directors and on stage for the iPhone event. He hadn't told Rubin what Apple was doing or that Google would be giving the iPhone maps and YouTube. Rubin was shocked. Collectively, they realized Microsoft might not dominate mobile at all. Apple might. So they spun around and refocused Android entirely at iPhone. Of course, Schmidt hadn't told Apple and Steve Jobs what Google and Rubin were doing either, but that's another story for another video. Platform Experience Purple started out as a massive original Surface table-style proof of concept, initially intended for a tablet, something closer akin to what became the iPad.
And Steve said, do you think we could take that demo and shrink it down to something big enough or small enough to fit in your pocket?
Just to test multi-touch, inertial scrolling, rubber banding.
Try to move it and nothing will happen. So that's when I started to think about what can we do to make it feel still alive somehow, that it's some kind of gift to it.
But that's what sold it.
And so we go through it again. We go through the whole thing again. Yeah, Steve was pretty much blown away.
When I saw the rubber band, inertial scrolling, and a few of the other things, I thought, my God, we can build a phone out of this. And I put the tablet project on the shelf because the phone was more important.
Apple originally had two separate purple teams, a more conservative P1 team led by the iPod team's Tony Fadell.
Well, we tried 30, 40 different ways of making the wheel not become a old rotary phone.
And a more audacious P2 team led by Scott Forstall, previously on OS X.
What will cannibalize iPod sales? And one of the biggest concerns was cell phones.
The fear was that P2 would take longer to develop, and so Apple would release P1 first to hit the market sooner, and then follow up with P2 when it was ready. But the P2 team was so driven, they ended up beating P1 to key milestones.
I was sort of generally paying attention to what was happening on the P1 side. And what I really wanted to do was I wanted to show working functionality on P2 before there was working functionality on P1.
P1 was never needed. P2 was the iPhone. It had gone from a bunch of giant, disparate parts to components on a board to a wallaby. Yeah, to a wallaby. To a phone. And from a dream, a risk, a gamble, a hope, to a reality. In addition to everyone I already mentioned, from Bob Mansfield's platform technologies, to Tim Cook's operations, to Phil Schiller's marketing, to Katie Cotton's public relations, to Henri Lamoura's software, to Kim Voras's program office, to, well, the list just goes on and on. The iPhone was an incredible team effort at Apple, the team effort of a lifetime. Greg Christie, Baz Ording, Imran Chowdhury, Mike Mattis, and others had been working on the human interface and interactivity for a long time already. But there had also been a debate about whether the interface should use AppKit like the Mac, WebKit like Safari, or something new.
The AppKit delegation was Ollie and Kristen, and they had come back and said that AppKit has too many other, desktopisms that are buried in there and probably too much baggage to make AppKit a viable alternative.
You have to remember, I'm the czar of all things web at Apple at that time. And I'm going back and forth, and Scott looks across the table and says, Don, should we do this with WebKit? And I said, much to the irritation of some of my own people, no.
The something new won and would come to be known as UIKit.
The original plan was to make it so that stocks and weather and maps were these things that were really just widgets, sort of in the OS X sense of the word. But I remember there was a meeting where Steve was kind of playing with some of these widgets and realized that they just didn't launch as fast as the native apps, and they didn't feel right, and they didn't, do all the things that the native apps did. And so there was a quick scramble to convert those all to sort of native apps, to get them off of HTML and CSS and things like that.
Ken Kashinda, who'd been part of the Safari team, had peeled off to build the virtual keyboard because that's how things were and are done at Apple.
I realized that the shapes of the keys, which didn't change from your perspective as a user, as a person typing, but that the keys could change shape from the perspective of the software. For example, if you type T and then H, well, what's the most likely letter that you want next? Well, obviously E. And so what would happen is invisibly, the E key became larger.
Macworld wasn't a finish line. It was a shot from the starting pistol. Johnny Ive, Richard Howarth, and the industrial design team's work had largely been completed.
For something like the iPhone, everything defers to the display.
But hardware engineering still faced challenges. Steve Jobs scratched the pre-release plastic iPhone screen with the keys in his pocket, so he asked the team to come up with a better solution. They turned to Corning.
I need a transparent material that doesn't scratch, but at the same time, it is highly damage resistant.
Which had invented a new chemically hardened material, but had yet to find any commercial application for it. The team spun on a dime and got that glass into the iPhone. And now, of course, Gorilla Glass is rampant throughout the industry. And Richard Williamson's mobile web team was still racing as well. They'd already gotten that relatively full version of Safari up and running. Based on the same WebKit rendering engine developed for Mac, they'd also taken Google's location data and created the best Maps implementation ever seen on mobile, at least to date. But they were then tasked with adding a YouTube app as well.
We had also a good partnership with them on YouTube. We developed the client, just like we did with the Maps app.
Steve Jobs, meanwhile, was still teasing the iPhone.
Are you still on track to ship when?
Late June.
Late June.
Yeah.
That means like the very last day of June, or what does that mean?
Yeah.
And anticipation was growing. On June 6, 2007, Steve Jobs again took to the stage at Moscone West, this time for Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference.
But I do have one last thing that I want to talk about. And that, of course, is the iPhone.
One of the biggest question marks remaining about the iPhone was,
what about developers?
It was taking everything Apple had just to get the iPhone out the door, and there was literally no time to even have a meeting about what a native iPhone app SDK would look like, much less build it in time for launch. So
we've come up with a very sweet solution.
Jobs announced Web 2.0 apps as the immediate development platform.
They run securely on the iPhone so that they don't compromise its reliability or security.
He didn't say it at the time, but the thinking was it might take another 2 years to go native. Of course, the same team ultimately managed to get it done in 1. The other thing Jobs announced was the launch date.
The iPhone ships on June 29th.
P2 became M68, or iPhone 1,1. It had a 3.5-inch LCD screen at 320 by 480 and 163 ppi, and a proximity sensor, an ambient light sensor, and an accelerometer that could automatically rotate the screen to match device orientation, a quad-band 2G Edge data radio, 802.11 BG Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 2.0 EDR, an ARM-based 1176JZ F/S processor, and a PowerVR MBX Lite 3D graphics chip, and 112 megabytes of onboard RAM. 2 NAND flash-based storage tiers, one 4 gigabytes, the other 8 gigabytes, with a 1400 milliamp hour battery, and a 2 megapixel camera. There was a 3.5 millimeter headphone port, though it was recessed so much only the skinniest of jacks, like Apple's EarPods, could fit in. It could also be charged and critically synced to iTunes by the same 30-pin dock connector as Apple's already exceedingly popular iPod. What the original iPhone didn't have was CDMA and EVDO Rev A data network compatibility. That meant it couldn't work on 2 of the US's big 4 carriers, Verizon and Sprint. Not that it mattered. Verizon had taken a hard pass on the original iPhone, and so it would launch exclusively on Singular, which had just rebranded to AT&T. The original iPhone also lacked GPS, or support for faster 3G data speeds. In addition to no hardware keyboard or stylus, the iPhone also didn't have a removable, user-replaceable battery, or SD card support for extra storage. None of that pleased existing power users of the time, nor did the absence of an exposed file system, copy and paste, or any form of advanced text editing, and MMS either.
Yeah, but that was already in the works a while before. Wow. Because we knew that we wanted that, so... Right.
But the novelty and experience were so good, many people simply didn't care about the missing features or the higher price tag. Lineups had been forming for days outside Apple stores, especially flagship stores like the Glass Cube in New York City, where they went around the block and then around again. Anticipation was stratospheric. Competitors were dismissing it. Media was calling it the Jesus phone. And then the doors opened. The initial reaction was positive.
It is the most beautiful, the most radical smartphone or handheld computer I have ever tested.
Scrolls like butter, as they say. If I had to rank the iPhone on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd have to give it a 9. It's enjoyable, it's fun, and it's just a great phone.
But the price did prevent iPhone from getting into as many hands and lives as Apple wanted. So at the September 5, 2007, The Beat Goes On music event, Steve Jobs not only introduced the first iPod Touch, he announced
we're going to focus on just the 8 gigabyte model. The 8 gigabyte model is not going to sell for $599 anymore. Starting today, effective immediately, going into this holiday season, we are going to price the 8 gigabyte model of the iPhone at just $399.
There was still no subsidized price, even on contract, but there was movement. Like I said, the iPhone was an incredible team effort inside Apple, the team effort of a lifetime. And if you're ever interested in being part of a team like that, but you don't know where to start, take a look at Brilliant. Brilliant lets you get started each day, every day, by solving real problems, using real concepts and applying them. And if you like the daily problem, then there's more like it in the quiz on the left, so that you can explore the concepts in much greater detail and develop your framework. These thought-provoking challenges will lead you from curiosity to mastery, one day at a time. So what are you waiting for? Go to brilliant.org Brilliant.com/vector and get smarter and closer to your goals every day. Thanks, Brilliant, and thanks to all of you for supporting the show. The original iPhone ended up selling over 6 million units in its first year on 4 carriers in 4 countries. Now, Apple sells hundreds of millions of iPhones a year on almost every carrier in almost every country. And it ties everything together from Mac to Watch, HomeKit to HealthKit, CarPlay to AirPlay, HomePod to AirPod, iCloud to Apple Music, and a lot more to come. Steve Jobs told his team that the world would never be the same. How utterly right he was. Looking back now, 12 years later, what do you think of the original iPhone moment? And what do you think's coming next? Hit like, hit subscribe, and I don't know, maybe take a moment to tell a friend or two about the channel. It really helps a lot. And then hit up the comments below and let me know. And thank you so much for watching.